Thanks for coming tonight. I'm Susan James, Library Manager here at Bayless Library and also Assistant Director of the Superior District Library. And we're pleased to be hosting this event tonight. Do check out the display in the lobby and down the hall. And before we move on, I wanted to mention this is a big week for us with events. We have a ragtime concert tomorrow night, a ragtime pianist coming, Peter Bergen at 7 p.m. in this room, and we're not usually open on Fridays, so come check it out. And then on Saturday we have an open house and book release signing that coincides with Les's at Island Books. We'll have a couple of the authors, he'll have more. But River of Destiny, the book written by Joseph and Estelle Baylis from 1955, is being republished with an introduction or a foreword by Bernie Arbic. So he'll be here Saturday at 1 o'clock to talk about the book. And also Phil Belfi will be here to say a few remarks about Joe Pete that's being republished as well. And Big John, also by Florence McGlinchey, is going to be published for the first time. And then also the library is publishing a little booklet that Alice Clapp wrote on Sault Ste. Marie and its names. It came out in about 1943. So that's what's happening here. And I guess without further ado, I'll introduce Susan Pluska of Canada International.
Thank you, Susan. So I'm introducing Dr. Andrew Ringlee. He's with the United States of America Vietnam War Commemorations. He's a historian. He works in the History and Legacy branch. And he does a lot of, he's done a lot of writing for their website and also for an award-winning, it's in the Pentagon. If you visit the Pentagon, you can see it on the tour. It's a new award-winning Vietnam War corridor exhibit. He's received his Ph.D. from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 2016, and he's a specialist on Russia. But he's been working on the Vietnam War and doing a lot of research on that as well. You should also know that he's researching Native Vietnam veterans. So he's very interested in that, and he's working on producing some material on that for the commemorations. So,
thank you, Susan. Thank you for coming. I've had a wonderful time in Sault Ste. Marie. The past couple of days, we're here to conduct oral history interviews. This is something that we do around the country, and this is one of the best places we've ever been. The veterans are wonderful, and the support we've received from the town is fantastic. I'd like to thank Susan Huska and Carol Yee for being our contacts on the ground and doing the majority of the work for us to bring us here, and to throw a wonderful event to thank and honor Vietnam veterans tomorrow as part of Engineer Day. I'd also like to thank the folks at the Bayless Library for hosting this event and for providing support. So without further ado, I wanted to call this to honor their service and sacrifice, Vietnam veterans, in a variety of wartime experiences. We've done about 500 oral history interviews, which means we met about 500 Vietnam veterans. I'd say of those 500 interviews, the majority are certainly Army, almost majority were enlisted men, but many Marines, many Air Force, many Navy. A number of women, actually more women than you would think, because women live longer, and many of the women are still alive from that era. And I will talk a little bit about just the variety of experiences and the perceptions that we've received, and some ways as a historian to kind of challenge your thinking about the Vietnam War. Right now, there's a lot of popular interest in this war. Ken Burns did a documentary series, 10 parts. I know it's controversial. Some people might not like it. Some people might like it. I will, in his defense, I think he did a very good job of trying to incorporate a wide variety of perspectives in that documentary. He talked to a lot of people. He spent a lot of time and a lot of money making that documentary series. And the benefit of it, at least, is it gets people talking. It gets people thinking about these experiences, thinking about just their own connection to it, but also the nation's history during this time period. So, and I'll begin by explaining the commemoration a little bit. Whoops. here we are. So the Vietnam War commemoration was authorized by an act of Congress under President George W. Bush in 2008. But it really didn't take off until 2012 with a large event at the Wall. President Barack Obama spoke. There were many other dignitaries there, famous Vietnam veterans. And then it was reauthorized by President Donald Trump in 2017. And it's established under the auspices of the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense provides the funding for it. This is the third national commemoration the Department of Defense has done. The first one was they did a commemoration for the Second World War during the 90s, went from 1991 to 1995 to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Second World War. During that commemoration, a lot of Korean War veterans spoke up and said, we didn't really get a welcome home. We fought in a forgotten war. Are you going to do something for us? And they did a Korean War 50th, and then they did a Korean War 60th. And then Vietnam veterans started to petition their congressman and tell people we should do something for us. And so it began as an initiative within Congress. And some of the early supporters really for the Vietnam War commemoration were congressmen who had served in Vietnam. People like Jim Webb, Tom Ridge at the time was in Vietnam. He was actually, by 2008, he was out of Congress, but he was an early supporter, an early activist in Washington trying to get this movement going. So here's some images from that event. You see Ash Carter, you see Barack Obama, you see in the bottom left is Everett Alvarez, who was the longest serving prisoner of war in North Vietnam during the Vietnam War. You see Joe Biden. There's a lot of dignitaries at it. That was by far the largest event that the commemoration is hosted. And within the public law, there are 5 objectives of the commemoration. And the first is to thank and honor Vietnam veterans and their families. The second is to highlight the services of the armed forces. The third is to pay tribute to contributions made on the home front. This is one of our more controversial objectives, but when you really start to look at, there were people on the home front playing a role in the conflict supporting troops. There were religious groups involved in it. There were civic organizations. There were some. However, what this doesn't mean is we are commemorating anti-war protesters. We're not doing anything like that. So we've taken a little bit of flack for that third one. The fourth is also the advances in science and technology. Oftentimes our critics will say, well, you're commemorating napalm and Agent Orange. We're not doing that. All of these objectives come from previous commemorations, but during the Vietnam War, it's important to recall that there were important advances in medical technology, important advances in military technology that developed during the war or matured during the war. And many of the advances in medical technology were then applied to civilian medicine, so we still benefit from them. Then lastly is to recognize contributions of the allies. During the Vietnam War, we had 5 external allies. There were Australia, New Zealand, Korea, South Korea, Thailand, and the Philippines. According to VA statistics, there were 9 million American service people who served in the armed forces from November 1st, 1955, which we call the beginning of the Vietnam War. It's controversial. When did the Vietnam War begin? The reason why we denote that date is because that was when MAC Indochina, was Military Assistance Command Indochina, changed its name to MACV, Military Assistance Command Vietnam. So after the war with the French, Vietnam was split from Laos and Cambodia, and they redesignated the Military Assistance Command then. There weren't a great number of American service people involved in Southeast Asia until around 1960, and then the number steadily grew, particularly after 1965. And the reason why we ended in 1975, we actually ended May 15, 1975, which is after the fall of Saigon. And it was afterwards there was a ship, a merchant ship taken by the Khmer Rouge off the coast of Cambodia, the Mayagwez incident. And the United States deployed Marines to an island in Cambodia where they believed the sailors, were being held hostage. And that resulted in actually a pretty nasty firefight on that island, and we suffered casualties. So after Saigon had fallen and the war in Vietnam was largely over, or at least over for the United States, it had been for 2 years, but this other action happened in Southeast Asia. During this time period, our statistics indicate that 2.7 million American service people, around 2.7 million, served in Southeast Asia. And we recognize all veterans from this era. The reason for that is because the Vietnam War shaped their service years, their period of service, in ways that are immense in every aspect of their service. The war was going on. But also, they all would have gone to Vietnam had they were sent. And when talking to veterans, I hear this again and again. It was complete luck that I was sent to this, complete chance to this unit, this outfit, this assignment, even maybe this branch, or they were sent a different direction. So, from that 9 million, the VA estimates that 7 million are still alive. They live all over the country, and right now we have some from Canada too who've come, and I'm sure in foreign countries as well. The Vietnam War commemoration to this point has distributed approximately 2.2 million lapel pins. Lapel pin, what I'll show you next, is one of our means for reaching veterans. Here's a picture of it. Many of you have already actually received yours because there was an event here in 2016 when many of the local veterans received their lapel pins. But this follows a tradition of, after the Second World War, the Department of Defense issued service people a veteran's lapel pin, the ruptured duck pin. And that was a popular token that many veterans wore, particularly in the 1940s and 1950s. And during the World War II commemoration, because actually a lot of veterans from World War II had never received their pins or they had lost them, they reissued the ruptured duck. They changed it a little bit, but they reissued a ruptured duck to surviving World War II veterans. And so then in the then when they did the Korean War commemoration, they created a Korean War pin. There was never an original Korean War pin, but they created one for that commemoration, and so we have a Vietnam veterans lapel pin. And to this point, the VWC has distributed approximately 2.2 million lapel pins. We send the lapel pins to our commemorative partners, this is the way that the Vietnam War commemoration engages veterans. Because this is a national project, there's no way that an office with a staff of about 40 people in Washington, D.C. is going to be able to reach 7 million people. And we do this through a commemorative partner program, and commemorative partners range in size and stature from everything from Boy Scout troops to major universities, NFL teams, major Fortune 500 companies. And these are just a small selection of more prominent, recognizable commemorative partners. But the commemorative partners enable us to reach Vietnam veterans in their home communities. It also enables their home communities to touch Vietnam veterans, which we think is really important because where many Vietnam veterans were not recognized when they came home was from their home communities, and that's so important that this is done in a local setting. In our commemorative partners, the way they engage Vietnam veterans, the way they thank and honor them is in public events. And to date, our commemorative partners have held, this is actually dated as of January 1st, 2018, but about 11,588 events. So this number is a lot higher. In fact, this year has been one of the most active years for our partners. I know that March 29th, which is Vietnam Veterans Day, and this Memorial Day, this past month, we sent more pins, we sent support to more commemorative partners than we had in previous years. And that's because 2018 is the 50th anniversary of 1968. So we expect this year to be very active. We expect next year to be very active because 1969 was the year of peak U.S. troop numbers in Vietnam. And here's just what you can see is the lapel pin. On the back it says, "Grateful Nation thanks and honors you, USA Vietnam War commemoration," and some information on it. So within the commemoration, I work for the History and Legacy branch, and our mission is to provide the American public with historically accurate materials and interactive experiences that help them better understand the Vietnam War and also to direct them to additional resources should they want to learn more. We do this through several different initiatives. We've done the Pentagon exhibit within the Pentagon. That's a quarter-length exhibit within the Pentagon. We have an online timeline. Now there's one that resides on our website, and we are building a second one that's more comprehensive that will have additional features. And we've distributed fact sheets and a poster series. Posters are geared more towards high school kids, but you can see examples of them in the lobby here at the library. And we've reached out to educational partners in schools. We have a teacher's toolkit, which is a pedagogical guide, a resource guide to teachers that enable them to find out more information and adopt some lesson plans for both projects on the Vietnam War, but also service learning projects more generally. So, and I'll show you some examples of those. And then we have our oral history program, and that's why we're in Sault Ste. Marie, or why I am in Sault Ste. Marie, to capture stories of Vietnam veterans. And here you can see some images of the Pentagon Corridor exhibit. Pentagon Corridor exhibit is the newest exhibit in the Pentagon. It took 50 years for them to create a corridor exhibit on Vietnam. It is the only corridor devoted to Vietnam. If you walk the halls of the Pentagon, you will find very little information on Vietnam. It's actually, the lacuna of information is striking. But we did this as a means of both informing the staff of the contribution of American service people during the Vietnam War, but also to inform the public. This is on the public tour of the Pentagon. It's extremely popular. It's the only exhibit within the Pentagon to win a national award. It's about 100 yards long, so it's the length of an entire corridor on the inner ring, the A ring, and it's very popular with the public and staff. I invite you all, if you come to Washington, D.C., I have my business card here. If you ask, I can get you in the Pentagon. I can get you a tour of the corridor exhibit. I'll arrange for that. So online, we have an online timeline. And what we did is, with our current timeline doesn't have all these features, but with the new timeline that's being created for us, it will have additional features. So each entry has just an entry with images and information, but then we've added a statistical page for relevant events that had a statistical component. We have a historical debate section. Many of these, the significant events during the Vietnam War, there's a historical discussion of the meaning of it, the relevance of it, the significance of it, the motives behind it. So we try to present the various sides of the story and then provide bibliographic entries for further reading, which is in the resources. And then we have the capacity too with this to link our oral history interviews to the specific events. And so if a vet talks about a specific event during the Vietnam War, what we'll do is we can edit that part out of their video, out of their oral history interview, and link it to that event on the timeline. So there you have the veterans themselves explaining the history of the war. And then a second thing and this will link to the timeline as well as a primary source project, we are creating, this slide doesn't look very good, but we are creating an online archive of hundreds and hundreds, this will stretch into the thousands, of PDFs of archival documents that relate to the Vietnam War. All sorts of things. And then the third is the posters and fact sheets. And these are you can see some examples in the entryway, but they're generally geared toward a public audience or high school kids. And these are just 3 of them. We did a series on riverine operations in Vietnam. We did a series on African Americans in Vietnam. We did a series on service people in Vietnam. I'm currently working on 3. I'm doing one on Native American veterans or Native American service people in Vietnam. Doing one on Latino service people in Vietnam, and I'm doing a 3rd one on Vietnam memorials. The history of those, because they have a really interesting history that actually began. The first one began during the Vietnam War. And then lastly, our oral history program. And these are just 3 examples of people that we've interviewed at different times. And we have every kind of veteran. We don't really have any people who were, to my knowledge, that were generals during the Vietnam War, or flag officers at that level, but still some colonels, people who were colonels during Vietnam that we've been able to do. Every kind of wartime experience, so, and like you said, many enlisted. So. And then educational outreach. We speak at, we don't speak at schools, but we speak with teachers and encourage them to incorporate the Vietnam War in history syllabi and to conduct pedagogical programs to teach students about the Vietnam War, about service people, about veterans. And oftentimes what this is they'll do their own oral history projects. They'll have veterans come speak to them. So they might have a veteran show them a cemetery or memorial, explain the significance of that memorial to them. And so now a little bit more on the Vietnam War experience for service people. Like I said, there were about 2.7 million Americans that served in the Vietnam War. Of this time period, what's interesting is the 2 major wars before that, the Vietnam had a smaller percentage of Americans go to it than World War II in the Korean War, or a smaller percentage of Americans enlist in the military during these wars. Only around 40% of draft-age males served in the Vietnam-era armed forces. And of those 40%, about 10% were drafted, or served in Southeast Asia. We actually don't know the number of minorities because the Department of Defense at this time period only kept statistics on African Americans. Not until 1979 did they start taking statistics on Latino Americans, Asian Americans, and Native Americans. But what we can surmise is about 10% were African American at this time period. At this time period, African Americans were about 10.8% of the population. So it's roughly close to their overall percentage of the population. During the Vietnam War, 7,500 women served in theater, and they served in the 2 most common roles were nurses or clerks. And what's interesting about Vietnam is average age for an enlisted man in 1968, 1969 was 19 years old. That was far younger. During World War II in Korea, the average age for enlisted men was over 20. And during this time period, it's important to remember too, the voting age for American citizens was 21 before 1971. So, yeah, question, please.
I don't, Andrew, you didn't say, can we ask questions as you
Yeah, if you like, yeah.
Well, when I see these statistics, I said to myself, well, wait a minute. Right here in this community, the way for, I'll quote, the white guy to stay out of the service was to stay in college, stay in school.
Yep.
And so the unit that I served with, an infantry unit, was made up of predominantly Hispanics and blacks, because they weren't going to school. Many of them were lucky to get a high school education. Mm-hmm. So I kind of wonder about this one. I think the minorities were a higher number.
So I'm going to address that in a second, because it depends on what unit you were in. Remember, because people from working class and minority communities tended to be in combat. They didn't have the means, wherewithal, or the knowledge, or whatever to stay out of those less desirable roles, and that is a truism with it. Combat units, especially later in the war, some combat units were as high as 75% draftees. So about 1/3 of the armed forces at this time period were made up of draftees, and there were often higher concentrations of draftees in combat units That, at the beginning of the war, 65, 66, you're looking at about 50% of many combat units. As the war progressed, that got as high in certain ones as 75%. The draft was largely engineered by General Lewis B. Hershey, who led the selective service system from 1941 until 1968, I believe. And it was designed as a social engineering project. And it was designed to target two classes of young men, particularly working class and middle class men. This is the era of the Cold War, and the era of the space race, the competition with the Soviet Union, anxieties that there is a science and technology gap between capitalist West and the Soviet Union. The draft was designed to encourage middle class men, the men that had the means to attend college, and to then, at college, pursue specific fields, which were engineering, science, medicine, and even pursue those into graduate school, and find employment in those fields, and because of that, they could receive draft deferments. At the same time, during the Cold War, there was anxiety that working class males, particularly after the Second World War, when there was fears that there might be another economic crisis similar to the Great Depression, that these youths would be more susceptible to either lethargy or crime or even the influence of communism. One means of turning them into patriotic, productive citizens would be draft them into the armed forces. And that was how the draft was used by people like Hershey. That's how it was justified. And there were during the Vietnam War, there were two projects because the draft was actually not fulfilling the numbers that the armed forces needed. The first were New Standards Men, where they actually lowered aptitude requirements or test scores on aptitude and physical tests to enable people that were less qualified to be drafted. And the second was Project 100,000. And I could read, just to show you sort of the arrogance of this project, a quote from Robert McNamara. Project 100,000 was designed, it was a Great Society program under Lyndon Johnson, designed to enable the men from the poorest communities to be drafted or enter the armed services. Poor of America have not had their opportunity to earn their fair share of this nation's abundance, but they can be given an opportunity to serve their country's defense, and they can be given an opportunity to return to civilian life with skills and aptitudes which for them and their families will reverse the downward spiral of decay. Many of these men who were drafted in these two programs, or allowed to enter the military in these two programs, were in fact not given adequate skills to re-enter society and become productive member of societies. They were often channeled into either the most menial jobs or combat positions once they entered the military. So during Vietnam, the tour of duty, most service people served a 12-month tour, especially if they're in the Army. Marines served 13 months. Tours varied in length depending on branch and military occupational specialty. Many pilots served shorter tours, but they may have served many tours. All pilots were officers. Tours different between officers enlisted. Officers often served, if they served a year-long tour, they were often only in the field commanding men for 6 months. The idea at the time that people like Robert Mack fight the Soviet Union, we need a lot of officers, junior level officers experienced with command and combat roles. So they would put them in for 6 months and then remove them and give them staff positions in the rear for the next 6 months. The consequence of this is it destroyed unit cohesion. It meant that many officers, as soon as they were actually learning how to be junior level officers, were taken out of that role. And it caused the men to oftentimes mistrust their officers and be quite unhappy with those in charge of them. And at the time, military leaders believed these were short tours, a year-long tour is deemed a short tour, and they believed that it improved morale because of this, and it also improved the capacity of the United States to wage this war. They thought that by having a short tour, that would then return this in a 2-year drafty enlistment period, that would actually reduce the effect on society. It would diminish any anti-war sentiment within the United States. It would make the war more politically palpable to voters back home. Strategy in the Vietnam War really didn't change, which is surprising, from 1955 to 1975. The biggest thing that changed actually was the ethnicity of the soldiers fighting the war. From 1955 to 1965, it was the Vietnamese. From 1965 to 1971, it was the Americans doing the majority of the fighting, and afterwards, from 71 to 75, it was again the Vietnamese. The United States really wanted to fight big unit wars, big set-piece battles at the beginning of the war, using large amounts of force mobilized against regular North Vietnamese units. They found examples of this at Nha Trang, for example, early on, but the war was primarily an insurgency with activities around either the demilitarization zone, which is the area that split North and South Vietnam, or along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which ran along the border, where they're contacting regular North Vietnamese troops, but they're oftentimes contacting them in small numbers. It was a very decentralized war. It was a war where the United States struggled to really figure out how they wanted to fight the war. And all throughout, there was serious concerns that the South Vietnamese were never going to be able to take over this war on their own, which proved to be the case. A unique characteristic of the Vietnam War that most people don't realize is because the popular imagination of the war is grunts in the ground in small units, platoon or squad size in the jungle. But the Vietnam War is in the long array of military history, is the greatest application of air power in history. Vietnam saw more bombs dropped than all other wars put together. I repeat that. We dropped 4 million tons of bombs on South Vietnam, our ally in this war. That's more than double the total of bombs dropped in the Second World War. Consequently, though, the air war was, the United States lost about 11,000 aircraft during the Vietnam War. Over half of those, the majority, were helicopters. Now that compares to the Second World War, when the United States lost 95,000 aircraft. So many more aircraft went down. However, during the Second World War, the overwhelming majority of those 95,000 were in accidents, not combat-related situations, whereas Vietnam, that was the opposite. The North Vietnamese faced American air power, for longer than any adversary that this country's waged a war with, unless you maybe would count the Taliban today. And air power, in many ways, really didn't affect their capacity to wage a guerrilla insurgency in South Vietnam. The CIA estimated 65,000 North Vietnamese civilians died during Rolling Thunder, so it was a significant number of deaths in North Vietnam. But air power works best against an industrialized economy. That's what strategic air power was always designed to do. And North Vietnam did not have an industrialized economy. The second component of the Vietnam War is this was the war that was perhaps studied the most while people were fighting it, as the technocratic war. Really in two metrics that were used. One was body counts that we know. Body counts were used both by MACV as a way to justify, to measure success, and it was also used by the media in the United States to try to garner support for the war. Major media outlets, particularly before 1968, used to display body count during their nightly news reports as they would football scores. And the belief behind it was, by justifying to the American public today's body count, that would improve morale in the rear and improve and strengthen American support for the war by demonstrating progress. A second interesting, the Hamlet evaluation system was another metric that MACV developed to try to show progress. The Hamlet evaluation system tried to determine the political loyalty of villages based on 16 different factors. This entire metric, in retrospect, to me just sounds crazy. How you can determine the political loyalty of a village of people by asking them questions like, what do you think of the government in Saigon? And if you receive a 70% approval rate, then that means that this village is politically loyal to the government. And you have, remember too, you have oftentimes a American military advisor and a Vietnamese translator out in the villages trying to ask these questions. You're going to get very skewed responses from Vietnamese peasants who who really oftentimes just want to be left alone. And then the third is the order of battle controversy. And I think this is actually really fascinating. The CIA, a lone wolf CIA agent, had looked at MACV's estimates for Viet Cong strength in South Vietnam, and he found that the MACV was constantly telling him that the Viet Cong strength was, we'll say, 200,000 throughout the entire country, and last month's Viet Cong casualties were 50,000. Then they would say they were constantly underestimating. And when this really, his name was Sam Adams, and he warned his superiors, and it was his warnings, which came up with his own estimates, which were double what MACV was saying for potential Viet Cong strength in South Vietnam. They went nowhere. They were all buried. And that the danger of doing this, of trying to use using the lowest estimates as your base for determining policy in Vietnam, really came to the fore in Tet when the Viet Cong not only launched huge offensive throughout the country, but also continually suffered losses that should have made their attrition, should have attrited them into non-existence. And yet they were able to launch Tet in January 1968. They then launched another offensive in March of 1968. They launched an offensive in August of 1968. And there was a Tet offensive in 1969. So that was not one surprise attack or even a one campaign. That was a series of campaigns and a significant escalation of the war. And then another way to think about is the helicopter in Vietnam was really I think should be viewed as a double-edged sword. It improved mobility. It certainly improved survivability of soldiers who suffered wounds. But it also ensured that the war would be fought in remote parts of the country, that we would be sending service people into areas where they would be vulnerable. And because a helicopter is actually a very sophisticated piece of equipment, it also ensured that there would be a huge logistical tail to keep these machines flying. Estimates run as high as 80% of service people in Vietnam were actually not in combat roles. Servicing the helicopter, maintaining the helicopter was a huge amount took a huge amount of military capacity. And another interesting, for many units though, if they were close to fire bases or had the ability to call in air power, actually the small decentralized firefight was not really the method for attriting the enemy. The method for attriting the enemy was calling in overwhelming supporting fire. And I put supporting in quotes here because this wasn't really supporting, this was the intention. The intention was to use small amounts of foot patrols to contact the enemy and then then destroy them using overwhelming firepower, be it artillery or airstrikes. And then, as I said earlier, in the helicopter, for example, was one, and air power in general, required a huge logistical tail. There are very different experiences between service people who served in the front and the rear. I very rarely hear that racial tensions were a problem at the front. From Vietnam vets. My impression from the literature is that drug use was very uncommon at the front. These are things, though, that there were problems that grew in the rear and mostly in rear areas. A small group of soldiers in the field are not going to, they're going to have to rely on one another. They're not going to have time to get high or to fight with one another. As well as politics at the front largely didn't exist. People didn't they didn't have time to be critical about the war, and they had no access to information from newspaper reports or what was going on in the United States. But all of these issues existed in the rear, and they grew as the war progressed. And they also grew because many of the service people had been exposed to these sorts of things in the United States before they entered the service too. What has come up in some interviews, and I find interesting, is when Vietnam vets who did serve in the rear said there's a degree of envy because disciplinary regulations often were kind of lax for front troops, whereas in the rear they felt like they were subjected to frustrating and silly military disciplinary regulations that front troops were not subjected to. But conversely, though, most people served in the rear, and there was a degree of animosity, obviously, from front troops for those who were in the rear. And lastly, the coming home experience. So, as most soldiers in Vietnam, many knew the day they were coming home. In fact, as the war progressed after '68, the United States, the MACV, tried to remove soldiers from frontline positions during their last 60 days of their tour to minimize casualties of soldiers who were soon to be returning. It's also, folks on the home front knew when they could expect their loved one to come home. So if they received that notification close to the end of their tour, it was deemed that that would cause greater problems. These are just some of the images. Most soldiers, my impression is when they returned home, they were met with indifference. People didn't really want to talk to them. There was certainly a generational divide between their fathers, who had largely served in World War II in Korea, and Vietnam veterans. I think that many felt that they didn't really have a place. They were adrift. I hear this all the time, that many Vietnam vets spent significant, sometimes years, even longer, decades or longer, really feeling disillusioned and like they didn't have a purpose and they couldn't talk to anyone about their experiences. Vietnam veterans, due to the nature of the conflict and because there were also many people exposed to rocket and mortar fire, or if they were at the front, they were fighting in small units in vicious combat that could break out at any time, suffered PTSD at high rates. Many people over there saw combat. And the coming home experience, though, for the average veteran, contrasts sharply with that of the POWs. The POWs were often given, especially the ones released at the very end in 1973, were given a very warm welcome home. And some social theorists look at this and they say, why were they welcomed home to an extent that the overwhelming majority of Vietnam veterans weren't? And he surmises three things. There's a sense of by welcoming home the POWs at the end of the war, that gave many people a cathartic sense that they had somehow done their duty, and it expunged them from those earlier sins of being both complicit in perhaps the anti-war movement or just being indifferent to soldiers when they returned home. And also, though, most POWs, and it's important to remember, they looked different from your average enlisted man returning home. like I said, the age of the average enlisted man was 19 years old. There's a good chance he came from a working class family or he was a minority. The POWs that came home in Operation Homecoming tended to be white, educated officers, family men. They had sons and daughters to meet them at the tarmac. So they made for better press. They looked better in the newspapers. The media embraced this image when they were so indifferent to so many others. And just to summarize some of the tragedy of the war, as of Memorial Day 2017, 58,318, there were 304,000 wounded. There still are over 1,500 MIAs. The cost this year was 1968 when 17,000 people were killed. The year 1967 and 1969 were also very bloody years when nearly 11,000 people were killed in both years. And peak deployment was 69. And I think it's important to remember this because while the commemoration does not do much with South Vietnamese, we've interviewed a few South Vietnamese refugees. Almost 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers were killed during this conflict. And the estimates for a total number of Vietnamese lives lost was 1.5 to 2 million. And the overwhelming majority of that number was Vietnamese killing other Vietnamese. And these are just two different, you see the Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., which is the most famous, but beneath it is a Vietnam War Memorial that began in 1969 in Angel Fire, New Mexico. And this is one of the first ones. And it was created by a father who lost his son in Vietnam. So, in some concluding remarks, I can talk briefly about Native service in Vietnam. This is the most current research that I'm working on. We don't know how many Native Americans served in the Vietnam era armed forces or went to Vietnam. The best that people can estimate is 42,000. Oftentimes they were miscalculated. If many natives, if they come from the southwest part of the United States, have Hispanic last names, so that makes it challenging. The DoD was not keeping statistics on these people. They're not even counting them as a ethnic group. And Native service people in Vietnam were not exploited as code talkers. And during the World War II, Navajo and other groups were used by the United States military for their language skills. During the Vietnam War, they did not do that, so there was no privileged position for them in the military. And consequently, though, they've really been ignored by historians. People haven't done a lot of work researching them. They were enlisted and accepted induction for a variety of reasons. It was both the same reasons that working class young men from all over the country served in the military, opportunity for economic advancement or education, to get out of their hometown, to do the patriotic wars that were just present in popular culture in American society. But also there is a strong tradition of military service in many Native American communities. Many communities, for some that have at some point in time entered a treaty with the United States government, there is often a compulsion among young men that they have to honor that treaty. And that's pressured from patriarchal figures within the community. But the reason for them, it often, the argument centers around the United States government may have broken that treaty with us, but we have not broken that treaty with the United States government. We will still serve. Within some Native societies, veterans or warriors, for a man to be a full member of the community, to have full political and religious authority within the community, they need to have served in some type of warrior military capacity. So it plays a role in it. There are certain ceremonies where veterans have to have specific roles to play, be that singing a certain song, leading a dance, or telling war stories is another tradition. most decorated Native American was Billy Walkabout, a Cherokee from Oklahoma. He earned a Distinguished Service Cross, and natives in service, they faced racism. The Indian Scout Syndrome, which is a racist idea that natives, due to this warrior lifestyle, and the fact they lived in or came often from rural areas, somehow would be better walking point. They could use their senses to track the enemy or detect the enemy. And at the same time, though, some natives embraced this. They thought, sure, that sounds good. I'm going to take chances to be the greatest warrior I can be. And another term that many of you probably heard too, that's a racist term that was applied that really came out during the Vietnam War, is Indian country. Indian country is area beyond the bases where the enemy exists, where the normal rules of combat or society are suspended. And what an interesting thing that I found is that many Native Vietnam veterans, when they came back, though, took prominent positions in what's often called the Red Power movement. Red Power movement, during the 1950s, the United States enacted a series of measures called termination, where the government began to chip away and remove Native rights and privileges that had set apart the reservations, the Native American nations, as independent entities within the United States. Termination looked at this hodgepodge of different of independent nations, autonomous nations, as being not beneficial to Native Americans because they're held out of mainstream American society. The goal was to assimilate them by removing these privileges and rights. And the Red Power movement resisted that. Red Power movement was, in part, it was a reaction to these policies of termination. It was also inspired in part by other 1960s movements, social movements. So Native Americans may have been exposed to the other social movements while they were in the service, and they oftentimes came back and joined these movements in their own communities. So that concludes really my presentation. Do you have any questions? Yeah.
Andrew, do you know much about the role of civilians in the military, serving in the rear area during this time? Or
Not really, actually. That's a great, I don't know a lot about, like, civilian contractors you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, there were USAID
Oh,
officers
okay.
on, and there were also, I imagine, support people
Yes,
as well?
yeah. So the big groups serving in Vietnam, besides the United States military, were USAID was there. The CIA was obviously there. Department of State had a lot of programs. And USAID was both economic projects. Then there were also, and oftentimes actually these would be coupled with the military. So it'd be like a military construction brigade would be, building a well that was paid for by USAID or something, a combination, a collaborative effort. There's also the medical projects. So their medcaps were conducted explicitly by the military, which was they go out to the village and they try to, give dental care or treat people for diseases or things like that. But in those, the civilian programs were all brought under an umbrella of CORDS, civilian, let's see, what is civil and revolutionary development. But it was under Robert Comer, who was later became the CIA director, and tried to develop the South Vietnamese. And one of the reasons, though, why a lot of these projects were needed so much is because they were dealing with refugees. The war caused many people to flee rural areas and move to cities, flock to cities. And that displacement then created all sorts of new problems.
And do you recognize those civilians?
Don't have a pin for them, but we do some oral history. We've done a couple oral history interviews with people who were State Department. One guy who worked for the Red Cross. So there are also some private organizations too, like the Red Cross. Michigan State University had people working in Vietnam early on doing what would be considered now international development studies more, but some actual projects, like test projects to see how to do. Michigan State was heavily funded by the United States government at this time period and intimately involved in the CIA, or I'm sorry, in the Southeast Asian development project. So, which is an interesting characteristic. Of all the universities, Michigan State is more intimately involved probably in Vietnam early on than in. But we don't have a pin for them. We don't. Yeah. It's since we're DoD, it's a veteran, and I can understand why we do that, but I think we could do more to recognize, to reach out to different civilian agencies. One group that's interesting that wasn't in Vietnam that I thought might be was the Peace Corps, and they're intentionally kept out because it would have been deemed very bad press that Peace Corps volunteers killed in Vietnam, but also the Peace Corps, it was concerned that they want to keep the Peace Corps far away from the CIA because they were afraid that if the Peace Corps ever got too close to the CIA, then Peace Corps volunteers everywhere might be targeted as CIA agents. So they were kept entirely. Now there's Peace Corps people in Vietnam, but definitely not during the war. Any more questions? Yes.
I don't have a question, but I just have a comment. It's interesting. I enlisted in the Army at the end of '75, and for the first decade after I started serving, we lived under a legacy of this war. We had broken equipment. We routinely lied about our statistics and logistics. It was that body count mentality carried over to our equipment and our operations and our operational readiness reporting, that mentality. Our officers were broken men. All the good officers, it seemed, senior enlisted, had left the service, and the other ones had stayed. Some of the officers were serving out their 20 years as senior enlisted, but it was a broken army that took us over a decade to repair. A lot of drug addiction, race riots, Ku Klux Klan. It was just an ugly military.
Yeah.
And so the legacy of this war, persisted in the military in ways I don't think have really been captured, what the cost of this war was.
Right.
In addition to, everything you're talking about, and veterans here were directly affected by that war or served in that war, and the families.
Yeah. That's similar to the experiences my father talks about. His years in the Air Force were very similar. It's a broken system, and it's very frustrating because it seemed like there were a lot of people who I think signed up and thought maybe making career during because Vietnam provided certain opportunities, and then those were all taken away very quickly too. The people who wanted to make a career of it, and it was a frustrated institution. Defense spending went way down after the war. The race problem persisted until the 80s. As far as I know. So it really, I guess and I've heard this statement made before. I think it comes from something in Greek philosophy, maybe even, is you ruin an army by taking it to war. Just by, the strains of going through this experience really causes a lot of difficulty and stress and problems. You create it by preparing.
Do you think the generals and the politicians really learned a lesson from Vietnam, or are they still going to repeat the same old thing in Iraq and Afghanistan or wherever?
Well, that's a great idea. Great question. In my opinion, they learned to minimize the political disruption in the rear, and they did that by removing
The draft.
Did they, and I think the unintended consequence of that, but what has been a consequence that has benefited them at the cost of the serviceman or servicewoman, is that it makes it easier to go to war and to stay in a war when the footprint of that war, the effects of that war are affecting a smaller portion of the population.
Right.
I think that if, and I'm speculating here, and this is, you're going to see like kind of my own, political views come out, but I think that, for example, the war in Afghanistan would have been the issue in the 2004 election
Yes.
had there been a draft.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it hasn't determined any major election since it began in 2011. So,
It's not even discussed. Really,
yeah, I mean, it's
Not an issue.
you can watch a news article, the evening news, and I don't even know, you might go an entire week without a mention of it. So, yeah. Please.
One way they made up the difference from during Afghanistan into Iraq was they brought local guard units.
Yeah.
There was almost every guard unit had at least
Yeah.
2 or 3 tours over
Yeah,
there.
I knew some people.
And you were bringing people that had the philosophy initially that a lot of draft eligible people during Vietnam went into the National Guard because they avoided going into the regular military and avoided Vietnam. But now it's different.
So, I mean, with the post-Vietnam reforms, you saw the military got much more capable of winning battles. They could pull off something like Desert Storm pretty easily. But does that
There's still a lot of
right? The relationship between winning a battle and improving national security is a question that's still up in the air.
Well,
So.
the politicians didn't listen to anybody in Vietnam, and didn't listen to them going into Iraq either, because they didn't bring enough people and they didn't bring the proper people.
Please.
You mentioned the Ken Burns series, and it is controversial, but I was 15 years old in 1968, and the thing I learned from that whole series was everybody lied right from the start.
Same with Afghanistan and Vietnam, or in Iraq.
Iraq, it seems like there was definitely some serious problems. I think Afghanistan, again, I'm curious just to, when the histories are written, what did they really think about what this would look like, after Al Qaeda had been eliminated? So I was in high school then, so I don't, when those decisions were being made.
We armed Osama to start with.
There was aid to the Taliban, yeah, when they were fighting the Soviets in the 80s, that's for sure.
He was a surrogate to fight the Russians in Afghanistan.
Which, an interesting parallel is looking at that war for the Soviet experience and the Russian experience, in comparing it to Vietnam. And there's no reflection on their end. They ignore that war, they ignore those veterans to this day. They get nothing. I mean, it's... Alright, well, thank you for coming. I appreciate the feedback and your comments and questions. It's really helpful and interesting. And, this has been a great experience.
Thank you.